Hi there, it's me, Finn. And tonight we're gonna talk about something really special. People often say they'd love to go back to medieval times. The castles, the knights, the old stone streets. But what if I told you, you probably wouldn't last a single day? That's not because of swords or dragons. No. It's because the everyday life back then was full of small, uncomfortable things. Tiny details that made life so different, so hard. Yet oddly peaceful too. You see, people in the Middle Ages didn't live like us. They didn't wake up to alarm clocks, check their phones, or drink coffee with cream. And if you suddenly woke up in their world, you might feel very confused, very cold, and maybe even a little amazed. So tonight, let's walk through that world together. Slowly, quietly. Let's start by subscribing. Now, close your eyes and imagine. The first light of morning touches the thatched roof of a little house made of wattle and daub wooden beams, filled with mud and straw. The house creaks gently in the wind. There's no glass on the windows, only wooden shutters, and there's no real front door either, just a thick, heavy cloth to keep out the wind. Inside, it's very dim. Only a tiny sliver of light slips through a crack in the shutters. A man maybe in his 30s, but looking much older, slowly wakes up on a straw-stuffed mattress on the floor. His wife is beside him, wrapped in a rough wool blanket. The blanket smells like sheep, because well, it was a sheep once. It's scratchy and thick. Their two small children are curled up at their feet, wrapped in another blanket. They sleep all together in one bed, like most peasants in the village. There's no bed frame, just the cold earth underneath, covered in rushes, plants laid across the ground like a carpet. Every few weeks the rushes are changed out, because they start to smell after a while. There's no plumbing, no bath, no soap nearby. The man opens his eyes to the smell of smoke. A fire was burning in the hearth last night, but now it's mostly ash. He gets up slowly. His bones feel stiff. It's chilly, even inside the house. His breath forms little clouds. There's frost on the edge of the wooden wall. He grabs a simple wool tunic, his only real garment. He's worn it for years. It's coarse and rough but warm. His leggings are wool too, tied around his calves with bits of string. No buttons, just knots and wrap. He steps into shoes made of old leather. They're misshapen, cracked, and slippery on wet ground. He doesn't speak yet. People in medieval villages often spent the morning quiet. Life was so physical, and energy was saved for work. His wife stirs. She yawns and rubs her eyes. She'll get up soon to prepare something warm, if they're lucky. But there's not much to prepare. No pantry, no refrigerator. Just a wooden shelf with a bit of bread left from 2 days ago. A piece of cheese hardened from the cold. And maybe if yesterday was a lucky hunting day, an egg or two. The man steps outside. It's muddy, always muddy. Even the walk to the nearby field means stepping into thick, cold muck. He pulls a wool cap over his ears and grabs a wooden spade. That's all he has. No metal tools. Those are expensive. Just wood and muscle. His first task today: dig out the latrine pit near the edge of the garden. Not the most glorious job, but very important. And remember, no bathroom indoors. He walks carefully past a few other homes, each shaped like a lopsided box. Smoke rises from a couple chimneys. Some roosters are starting to call, but most of the animals are still sleeping. Chickens are tucked into corners of houses, or little lean-tos. A pig grunts softly from behind a fence made of woven sticks. The village is silent except for bird song and wind. Down near the edge of the fields, he sees a couple neighbors. They nod but don't speak much. One is already pulling stones from the soil. Farming means a lot of bending, digging, carrying, all with your hands. No gloves, just dirt under your nails, cold in your fingers. Back at the house, the wife lights a bit of kindling in the hearth. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let smoke out. It curls up into the rafters before escaping. The smell is sharp and earthy. Smoke sticks to the walls, to their clothes, to their skin. Everything smells of firewood and sweat. She takes a piece of bread and soaks it in warm water. No toast, no butter. But this is called pottage, a kind of soft, warm mush, made with bread, onion and sometimes dried herbs. If they had more, she'd add bits of root, vegetables, maybe carrots or leeks. But food is tight lately. The harvest wasn't great. She calls the children softly. They blink slowly and sit up. Their little hands rub their eyes. One of them picks a feather out of the straw bed. Let's pause and think for a moment. There are no toys, no books, no cartoons, just a morning full of smells, sounds and simple movement. The child picks up a stick and draws in the dirt. That's entertainment. The other walks outside barefoot for a moment, feet toughened from years of walking without shoes. The man comes back from the latrine area, wiping his hands on a rag. It smells bad out there, but that's light. Everyone shares that space. Some people have buckets indoors, which they dump every morning. It's unpleasant, but normal. He sits near the fire warming his hands. He says something to his wife, something simple, like "it'll rain today." She nods. No need to say more. Words are useful, but not wasted. The village bell rings softly in the distance. Not a clock, but a bell rope pulled by the priest. It signals that the sun is properly up. Time to start the real work. Not that they weren't already working. The man stands again, slowly. His back already aches, but that's how it goes. He has a few hours before he has to walk to the Lord's field. He works there 3 days a week, giving his labor instead of paying rent. That's part of the feudal system. You don't pay with money, you pay with your body. He'll spend the next hours plowing a patch of land, planting seeds or gathering wood. Sometimes he works with a team, sometimes alone. The tools are basic: wooden hoes, baskets woven from reeds, maybe a cart if he's lucky. Back in the village, smoke is rising from every house now. The smell of wood, cabbage, old cheese, dogs bark faintly. Someone beats a rug with a stick. Chickens cluck and scratch. A woman walks by carrying a basket on her head. It's filled with wool. She's heading to the weaver's shed. Another man leads a donkey cart with 2 broken wheels. He'll spend the day trying to fix them with nothing but rope and wooden wedges. Children chase each other around a tree. A boy trips, gets muddy, laughs. Life is simple, quiet, slow. And even though it's hard, it has a rhythm, a softness. But for someone like you, waking up in this world would be jarring. No lights, no shower, no sweet smells, no soft bed or clean socks. Everything is earthy, cold, close. And yet, something about it is also peaceful. No rush, no deadlines. People move at the pace of the sun. Even if you wouldn't last a day, you might still want to see it once. Let's keep going. The sun was climbing higher now, but it wasn't hot. It was early spring in the village. And though the frost had melted, the air still carried a damp, sleepy chill. The man stretched his back and rubbed the back of his neck. He stood by the wooden fence, watching the chickens pecking at the ground. One of the hens had laid a small pale egg near the hay pile. His wife carefully scooped it up, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the corner of their shelf. It wasn't much, but it was something. There was no breakfast table, no plates, just shared bowls and wooden spoons. Some households didn't even have spoons, just flat bits of carved wood. He dipped his spoon into the warm, soft pottage. More water than food, but still calming. The taste was earthy and dull, like boiled roots. There was no salt. Salt was expensive, often traded or gifted, and used very carefully. You might only get a small pinch a month, if that. He sat on a small wooden stool, legs uneven, wobbling on the earthen floor. His son sat beside him on a log, too short for his legs to dangle. The boy chewed his bread slowly, more out of duty than joy. Food wasn't eaten to be enjoyed, not really. It was eaten to last. After eating, it was time to begin the longer walk. The man grabbed his wrapped bundle of twine and a small tool, half blade, half hoe. His wife handed him a cloth tied with a little bit of leftover barley bread. That would be lunch. The children waved faintly, already pulling weeds by the hut's edge, learning the rhythm of the day. No school today. Most days weren't school days. He followed a winding path away from the houses. It was mostly mud and stones, shaped by footsteps over generations. The village sat near the edge of a forest, and beyond that the wide open fields owned by the local lord. To reach them meant walking for about half an hour, through thick grass, past hedgerows and over a wooden bridge that creaked with every step. Other villagers were already ahead, trudging slowly in pairs and small groups. No one talked loudly. They didn't need to. The rhythm of life had no rush. You saved your energy, because the work ahead would take everything you had. The Lord's fields were enormous, gently rolling hills dotted with wooden markers. These were the strips of land. Each peasant worked on the Lord's behalf. They didn't own them, but they were responsible for keeping them healthy and producing. Each family had to tend to a different strip every week. Sometimes it was plowing, sometimes planting, sometimes gathering hay. Today it was sowing seed. The man knelt beside his marked row. The soil was damp, cold and crumbly. He rolled out his small sack and reached in, feeling the rough barley grains. They were dry and gritty. He scattered them with practiced fingers. Not too thick, not too thin. He used his hoe to cover them with earth. Over and over, row after row. The rhythm was slow, steady, calming. His shoulders ached. His knees hurt. But his mind wandered. Far away, a crow called. He looked up and saw clouds gathering. Maybe light rain later. That could help the seeds. Or maybe not. The weather didn't follow plans. If it rained too hard, the fields would flood. If it didn't rain at all, the soil would dry out and crack. Either way, there wasn't much to do about it. Around him, other villagers worked in near silence. A woman with a thick braid pushed her spade into the soil again and again. Two teenage boys passed with a heavy wooden yoke, carrying buckets of water from a well nearby. The yoke creaked with every step. Their feet were bare, red from the cold and rough ground. He wiped sweat from his brow and sat back for a moment. His hands were already blistered from gripping the hoe, but he couldn't stop yet. He still had 5 more rows to do. Farther down the field, a man in finer clothes rode by on a horse. Not a war horse, just a sturdy, strong animal with well-fed muscles. The rider had clean boots, a soft fur collar, and leather gloves. That was the steward, the man who managed the Lord's estate. He didn't speak much to the peasants, unless something was wrong, but today he nodded at the man, and kept riding. That meant the work was good enough to be ignored. As the sun passed above and the wind picked up, the man finally paused again, and pulled out his small lunch bundle. The bread was dry, hard. He dipped it in the trickle of water running through a ditch nearby. That softened it just enough to chew. He closed his eyes for a minute, just a minute. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the far trees, the distant bleating of a sheep, the slow rhythm of digging, the groan of a cartwheel turning. It wasn't peaceful in the way we might think, but it had a kind of quietness, a kind of stillness. No buzzing machines, no cars, no phone calls, just the land, the people, the sky. He opened his eyes again and sighed, then stood up. He had more rows to finish before the bell rang at sundown. Behind him, 2 boys whispered as they walked, trading stories about a fox someone had seen near the woods. A small danger, but it made them feel alive. The fox wasn't the only threat though. There were wolves deeper in the forest, and sometimes wild boars, but mostly the real danger was sickness. Colds turned bad quickly. A simple cut could fester. No antibiotics. No hospitals. If you were lucky, the village healer had a mixture of herbs to place on a wound. But even that was rare. So people worked carefully, slowly. Even mistakes could be costly. Later, as the shadows stretched across the field and the clouds turned orange and gray, the bell rang softly in the village distance. The sound floated across the valley like a lullaby. The man stood, wiped his hands on his tunic, and walked back up the path. Other villagers followed, some holding baskets, others carrying sticks for firewood. One woman had a duck under her arm, freshly caught from the river. She smiled quietly, proud of her luck. Back in the village, smoke curled once again from the chimney. The smell of boiled cabbage and old onions filled the air. Children laughed near the well, chasing each other with long sticks. A dog barked once, and then settled into a patch of straw. The man entered his house, and sighed. He was tired, really tired. But that was normal. He took off his belt and sat down by the hearth. His wife had warmed some stew with the last of the barley. It was thin, but warm. She added a sprig of something green, maybe nettle or parsley. They ate in silence, except for the sound of slurping and chewing. The children leaned against each other, eyes heavy. One child pointed at a spider web in the corner. The other whispered a story about it catching a fly. There were no candles, just a single clay lamp with animal fat and a bit of cloth for a wick. It flickered gently, casting long shadows. The man shifted and rubbed his feet. He could feel the blisters forming under his toes. His shoulders ached. His hands were rough and dry. But there was something comforting about the quiet, something soft about the dark. They all lay down again together. One big blanket, one big breath. Outside, the night wind rustled the trees. An owl hooted once. Inside, the fire crackled softly, then faded. And though the man had lived many of these days before, he knew tomorrow would be the same, and the same again. But it wasn't boring. Not to him. It was life. Hard, quiet, real. And for you, would you still want to try and last a day? Maybe. But it's only been morning and afternoon so far. We still have the evening ahead. Let's keep going. The stars began to peek through the quiet evening sky, one by one, like tiny whispers. The warmth of the fire was still fading, and the clay lamp had already burned out. There was no clock, no ticking, just the passing of time marked by the change of light and sound. Night had fully arrived. The man stirred lightly in his place under the shared blanket. His body ached in quiet places. His back, his wrists, even behind his knees. He was used to it, but the ache always lingered, like the feeling of carrying a basket long after it was put down. One of the children shifted in their sleep, breathing softly. His wife's hand lay just over his arm, calloused and warm. But sleep didn't come easily for everyone. The youngest child had trouble falling asleep sometimes. She would wake in the middle of the night and ask strange questions, like why the stars were cold, or whether trees could hear footsteps. Tonight, though, she only mumbled something soft and turned her head toward the wall. Outside, it was so dark that the outlines of things, trees, fences, even the path, seemed to melt together. The village no longer made any noise. The animals were still. The wind had settled. Even the dogs didn't bark. The silence was so deep, it felt like it had weight. But the night wasn't just for sleep. It was also for watching. One person in the village, each night was chosen to stay awake a little longer, to check the fires, listen for trouble, and make sure no lanterns had been left burning. Fires were dangerous. A single spark could destroy a house. And if one house caught fire, the others could follow. Everything was made of wood, straw and cloth. Tonight, the watcher was the old miller's son, a boy with long legs and careful feet. He walked the paths with a torch, its flame flickering orange against the cool wall. He knocked gently on one door to check that an elderly woman had closed her shutters. He paused at the animal pens to listen for sounds of wolves or thieves, but all was quiet. Back inside, the man finally drifted into deeper sleep. His dreams were strange, as they often were, half memory, half story. In one, he was standing in a market full of bright red apples, something he'd rarely seen. In another, he was chasing a goose through a forest, and no matter how fast he ran, the bird always stayed a few steps ahead. By the time the sky began to lighten again, It was still hours before sunrise. A kind of pale gray washed over the village. Birds stirred in the trees, wings twitching. A rooster crowed in the distance. Not loud, not angry, just a soft call. Slowly, the village began to wake. Today was not a field day. Today was a washing and mending day. The man sat up slowly and rubbed his face. His beard was short but rough. There were no mirrors, just a small piece of polished metal he used to check for cuts. He drank a little water from a clay jug and passed it to his wife. She took a sip and stretched. The children were already looking for something to do. One of them grabbed a piece of firewood and started tracing shapes in the dirt. Another one followed the family cat outside, giggling at its slow tail. After a simple breakfast, more pottage, this time with a few crushed beans, they set out to the stream with a bundle of clothes. Washing clothes in medieval times was a full day's task. There were no soaps like today, only lye made from ashes, or sharp-smelling herbs like soapwort. The water was cold, even in spring. The stream wasn't wide, but it moved fast. The stones along the edge were smooth from centuries of use. Other villagers were already there. Women mostly, with sleeves rolled and skirts tied. They knelt on flat rocks and scrubbed fabric over wooden washboards, or just between their knuckles. The man joined them with a quiet nod. He wasn't shy about helping. Some men refused, thinking it wasn't their work. But for him, the rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing was oddly calming. Dip the shirt, rub the fabric, squeeze, beat it softly against the stone, rinse, repeat. They talked quietly, nothing loud. Just passing stories, comments about weather. And one woman shared that her goat had wandered off again. Another said she'd heard that a peddler might be coming in a few days, bringing ribbon and salt. The washing took hours. Some cloth was stained with oil, others just full of sweat and dirt. The man's tunic had a small tear, and after the washing, he would mend it with bone needles and rough thread. The stitches would not be pretty, but they would hold. After lunch, leftover stew warmed by the streamside fire. The man took the dry clothes back and hung them along a rope stretched between two trees. The breeze lifted the cloth slightly, like a row of quiet ghosts. He smiled faintly. Clean clothes weren't exactly soft, but they smelled like wind, like water, like nothing. A clean nothing. Back near the house, he checked the roof thatch. One of the bundles had loosened during the last windstorm. Climbing up was risky. The straw shifted under weight, but he needed to keep the rain out. He tied the bundle with a loop of ivy rope and patted the ridge firmly. From up here he could see much of the village. Small puffs of smoke, chickens chasing each other, a baby crying somewhere, a man leading a donkey cart full of firewood. It was simple, but not empty. Every motion had its place. Later that afternoon, the Lord's messenger arrived. The man saw the horse first. It was black and clean, hooves wrapped in soft cloth. The rider wore fine clothes and held a scroll tied with blue ribbon. He didn't stop at the man's house. He went straight to the steward's house at the center of the village. But the ripple spread quickly. The messenger only came when something was needed. Soon enough, a small group gathered near the village square. The steward read from the scroll slowly, his voice flat but loud enough to carry. The Lord was preparing for a visit. He wanted the village cleaned, roads checked, and offerings prepared. A hen from each household, a basket of grain and clean paths for his cart. There were no argument. It was simply accepted. The Lord owned the land, and everything on it. So the man returned home, and chose his best hen. One that still laid eggs, but not too young. It wasn't easy. Every chicken was food, eggs or hope, but refusal wasn't an option. That evening, instead of resting early, the man and his neighbors worked along the road. They filled small holes with pebbles, swept aside leaves, and patched a broken fence near the gate. It was slow work. Some used spades, others just their hands. One boy gathered small branches for kindling. Another old man sharpened the edge of the signpost by the entrance. By the time the sun dipped again, everyone was too tired to speak. But the village looked neat, calm, waiting. Dinner that night was soft cabbage and boiled leeks. The smell filled the house. They ate slowly. Even the children didn't ask for more. They knew it was enough. Tomorrow would be the Lord's visit. They laid down once more quietly. The fire glowed orange, smaller than usual. Outside, a fox watched from the edge of the trees. Its eyes glinted faintly in the dark. It didn't come closer, just watched. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves in small waves. The stars returned, soft and silent. And sleep, heavy and simple, came once more. Morning returned with the same soft light, slipping through the spaces between the wooden shutters. The birds were louder this time, singing from the branches outside. The man opened his eyes slowly, blinking into the pale glow. He lay still for a few minutes. He could already feel the difference in the air. Today was not just another day. The Lord was coming. It didn't happen often. Once, maybe twice a year. But whenever he visited, the village changed in small ways. People walked straighter. They cleaned things they didn't usually care about. Even the animals seemed quieter, as if they could tell something was different. The man sat up and reached for his tunic. It was still a little stiff from drying in the breeze, but it smelled clean. He put it on carefully, brushing off a few straw pieces stuck to the hem. His boots were already by the door, made from thick leather, cracked near the toes. He slipped them on and stepped outside. Other villagers were already awake, moving with quiet purpose. The steward's wife had sprinkled herbs near the gate to cover the scent of the animals. 2 boys were polishing a cartwheel, and 1 girl was sweeping dust from under a bench, even though it would return by nightfall. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath just a little. The man's wife handed him the woven basket. Inside was the offering, fresh grain tied in a linen cloth, and the hen, calm and warm. Its feathers were dark brown, and it didn't make a sound. He stroked its head softly. "Just for today," he murmured. As the sun rose higher, a sound began to grow in the distance. First it was just a slow rhythm, like someone tapping wood far away. Then the sound grew sharper. Hooves on dirt, wheels over stone, a distant jingle of metal. The cart was coming. Children were told to stay back. Adults stood along the side of the path, heads bowed slightly, hands folded, or holding gifts. The Lord's cart rolled into view, tall and dark with a crest painted on the side, golden lions against a green shield. It was pulled by 2 heavy horses, both with long braided manes. Their hooves sent up little clouds of dust as they passed. The Lord was inside, mostly hidden behind a fine cloth curtain, but they all caught a glimpse: broad hat, smooth gloves, a ring shining even in the shadow. He didn't wave. He never waved. But that wasn't expected. Lords weren't friends. They were above. Behind the cart rode 3 men on horseback. Their armor wasn't shiny like in stories. It was worn, dull and heavy looking. They watched everything. One of them met the man's eyes for a second. Just one. Then looked away. The steward stepped forward and gave the official welcome. His voice was careful, practiced, neither too loud nor too soft. He handed over a scroll, and one of the riders took it without a word. Then came the offerings. Each family, one by one. The man stepped forward when it was his turn. He bowed slightly, not too low, and offered the basket with both hands. The hen looked around quietly, blinking. The steward's helper took it and placed it in a larger cart, where other hens clucked softly. The man stepped back without a word. After all offerings were gathered, the cart was led to the edge of the village, toward the small house built for noble visits. It was larger than the others, with smoother walls and a chimney that never leaned. The Lord would stay there, likely for just 1 night, perhaps 2. With the formal part over, the villagers exhaled, quietly of course. The tension softened. They returned to their homes, back to small tasks. But the man was called back by the steward. He needed help preparing the outer path where the Lord might walk. It was narrow, often muddy. The man fetched fresh straw and laid it over the soil in long strips. He also swept the edges, with a rough broom made from reeds. It wasn't perfect, but it looked neater. The steward didn't say thank you. He nodded once. That was enough. As midday came and passed, the man returned home to rest his legs. His wife had boiled oats again and mixed in some dried herbs. It tasted slightly bitter, but filling. The children were told not to wander near the Lord's house. Instead, they played near the woods, building tiny forts from sticks and stones. In the late afternoon, a trumpet sounded once, sharp and short. It was the signal for everyone to stay indoors. The Lord was walking. From inside his house, the man watched through a small gap in the shutter. The Lord walked slowly, wearing a long dark coat and leather gloves. He wasn't old, but his face was hard and serious. A servant followed behind, holding a cloth umbrella to block the sun. He spoke only to the steward, nodding now and then, and pointed at things: trees, fences, the roof of the mill. At one point, he stopped near the man's house and looked toward the field. His face didn't change, but he seemed to say something brief. The steward wrote it down. Then they moved on. When the trumpet sounded again, it meant they were gone. The man opened his door and stepped out. His neighbor joined him, shrugging slightly. "Doesn't look too happy," the neighbor said. "They never do," the man replied. The rest of the evening passed slowly. The man checked the chicken pen again. Emptier now. The children came back, tired and dusty. The air smelled like hay and hot earth. The man's wife gave the children a shallow wash with warm water and mint leaves. Then she combed their hair with a bone comb. One child fell asleep sitting up, leaning against the door frame. By nightfall, the village was quiet again, but there was still a strange feeling in the air. A little stiffer, a little more careful. Even the dogs didn't bark as much. The man sat outside for a while before bed, watching the stars above. He could hear faint sounds from the Lord's house. A lute, maybe, and some quiet laughter. He wondered what kind of stories the Lord told, what kind of bed he slept in, whether he ever ate plain oats. Probably not. The man yawned and stood up slowly. His knees popped as he stretched. He went inside, blew out the little lamp, and lay down beside his family. The fire was low, the air was still. Sleep came, not fast, but steady. Outside the moon was pale and silent. The morning after the Lord's visit began quietly. The light crept slowly through the cracks in the shutters, touching the floor like golden dust. A soft wind moved the straw on the roof, and somewhere a rooster gave a half-hearted crow. It was the kind of sound that didn't wake anyone, just let them know the world was still turning. The man opened his eyes. His muscles felt tight. Sleeping on a hard bed did that. But he was used to it. He stretched his arms and heard a few small pops in his shoulders. His wife was already up, quietly moving about, folding the blanket, and checking on the children. They still slept curled up like kittens. He got up slowly, walked barefoot across the smooth dirt floor, and opened the door with a soft creak. Outside, the village had a strange stillness. Not empty, just slow. People walked softer today, like the ground might break under heavy steps. The Lord was still here. He hadn't left at dawn like some expected. His cart stood at the edge of the village, its wheels still damp with dew. The horses had been taken to the stream, and one of the guards was sharpening his knife on a flat stone. Nobody spoke to them unless asked. That was the rule. The man looked down the road. He had work to do. The stream needed clearing. Last week's rain had dragged sticks and leaves into the water, and now it flowed too slowly. If the water turned still, mosquitoes would come. Worse, the mill wheel might not spin well. He tied his belt and stepped off the porch, boots crunching softly on the ground. On his way he passed by 3 other villagers, working quietly, patching a fence with rope and nailless joints. They nodded at him. That was enough. The stream was not far. It ran gently beside a row of willow trees. their branches hanging like curtains. He bent down, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped into the shallow water. It was cold, like melted snow, the kind that bites your skin, even in summer. He worked slowly, pulling out twigs and tangled roots. His fingers numbed, but he kept going. The mud squished between his toes, and he could hear the rush of water speeding up as the path cleared. A dragonfly hovered nearby, wings shimmering in the light. Behind him, the sound of hoofbeats came again. He didn't turn around. Only lords and their men rode horses here. He stayed still, head down, until the sound faded away. He finished by midday. The stream flowed faster now, turning the little mill wheel again, sending small waves around the rocks. He stood up, stretched his back, and wiped his hands on his tunic. They smelled of water and moss. Back in the village, the steward was calling for all able-bodied men. A delivery had come with the Lord. Supplies for repairs, tools, a fresh barrel of salted fish. It needed lifting and storing. The man joined the others near the Lord's cart, careful not to look directly at the guard who stood watch. One by one, they carried wooden boxes and wrapped sacks into the old granary. It smelled like dust and dry grain. Pigeons fluttered in the rafters. Inside one crate was a strange object. Metal, round and smooth, like a pot but with holes. One man whispered, "It's for the Lord's bath." No one said anything else. They worked until their arms ached. The sun was higher now, warming their backs. Sweat gathered under their collars. Nobody complained. They just did what they were told. Later, after the last crate was placed, the steward handed out bread, not fresh, but thick and filled with seeds. The man bit into his piece slowly, chewing as he watched the village return to stillness. Some children ran along the path, giggling, their bare feet slapping the dirt. A woman was brushing a goat with an old comb, singing softly in a language the man didn't understand. He returned home and found his wife grinding dried berries in a stone bowl. She was making a paste to use for scratches and bites. He sat beside her and helped sort leaves. His fingers were still sore, but the movement was simple, soothing. As the evening came, a new sound filled the air, singing. It was soft and distant, coming from the Lord's house. Not loud like a feast, but gentle, like practice. Maybe it was the Lord's wife, or his daughter. Nobody knew. Few ever saw them. The man listened for a while, then stepped out again to feed the last of the grain to the chickens. They clucked softly, grateful. He sat on the edge of the pen and watched the sky turn purple. Soon, the Lord would leave. Things would return to their usual rhythm. The cows would walk slower. The children would shout again. Life would settle. He looked at his hands. They were rough, cracked at the knuckles, and stained with dirt that never truly washed off. But they were steady. They worked. They did what they had to. His wife joined him, sitting beside him on the wooden bench. She handed him a cup of warm water with mint leaves floating inside. It tasted clean. They sat like that, side by side, watching as the stars blinked awake. No words were needed. The silence between them was enough. It was a silence that held everything: fatigue, hope, comfort. The children were already asleep. One of them had kicked off their blanket, toes sticking out. His wife went to fix it, and he smiled softly. Far off, the lute played again, softer now, like a song slipping into dreams. The man stood and walked inside. He lay down, listening to the creak of the beams above. A mouse scurried in the corner. A dog barked in the distance, but only once. The fire was just embers now, glowing like sleepy eyes. The man closed his own, and the village, wrapped in shadow and quiet, slept again. The next day began with bells, not loud bells, like church towers ringing during a holy day. These were softer, smaller, made from iron, and they hung from the collars of goats. The little animals had wandered near the edge of the village, and were gently but firmly being brought back by a young girl with a stick in one hand, and a piece of stale bread in the other. She hummed a song as she walked, a tune that wasn't written down anywhere, just remembered from hearing it too many times to forget. The man woke slowly, blinking into the early light. The air felt cooler today. A breeze moved through the thatch above, making it sway gently like a cradle. He sat up, rubbing his neck. The soreness was still there. It always was. His wife handed him a small bowl of broth. It was thin, just warm water with a pinch of salt, and the faint memory of a chicken bone. But it was comforting. He drank it slowly, feeling it settle inside him like calm. Today, he had to walk to the next village. It was a few miles away, beyond the edge of the forest, near the hill where the wildflowers grew. A cartwheel had broken there last week, and the carpenter in that village had promised to shape a new one. If the man waited too long, someone else might take it. He packed lightly, just a piece of bread, a water skin, and a cloth-wrapped nail in case the wheel needed adjusting. His wife gave him a small piece of honeycomb. For strength, she whispered. He kissed her hand, and stepped outside. The road was quiet. The trees along the side seemed taller today, their trunks like old monks watching him pass. The path curved gently, winding like a lazy snake. Sometimes it narrowed so much he had to step carefully, not to trip on roots or sink into soft dirt. Birds flew above, silent except for the rustle of wings. Somewhere ahead he heard a cow lowing. That meant a farm nearby. He passed a marker stone with a carved cross, half covered in moss. No one remembered who placed it there, but people always nodded to it as they passed, just in case. A little farther along, he met a man pulling a cart full of hay. They nodded to each other, shared no words, and kept walking. Soon the road opened into a small clearing, and beyond it, he saw the roofs of the next village, smaller than his own, but busy. Chickens ran across the open space. A woman scrubbed a large pot near a well. Smoke rose from several chimneys in soft straight lines. The carpenter's hut sat near the edge. It was crooked, like it leaned just slightly to the left, but it smelled of fresh pine and oil. The carpenter greeted him with a gap-toothed smile and pulled out the new wheel. It was beautiful, not fancy, just round, solid, smooth, but beautiful in how right it looked. The man tested it, rolled it back and forth, checked the pegs and spoke. It held together without a sound. They spoke a few soft words about the road, the goats, and a nearby market that had recently failed because the pigs caught sickness. Before leaving, the man gave the carpenter a small pouch with a piece of wool cloth, a single iron nail, and a handful of dried mushrooms. That was the price. Money was rare, and trade was what lasted. He tied the wheel to his back with a rope and began the walk home. The return was slower. The sun was higher now, and the wheel pulled at his shoulders. But the rhythm of walking helped clear his mind. He thought of the garden, the new seeds his wife planted, and the way his children had laughed last night, when the youngest spilled water on his own foot and screamed like it was fire. Near the halfway mark, he stopped beside the stream. It looked clearer now. He cupped water in his hands, drank deeply, and splashed some on his face. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. One landed briefly on his sleeve, then flew away like it had somewhere important to be. When he reached the village, it was almost evening. The chickens were roosting. Smoke curled from his chimney. He saw his wife weaving something with thin reeds, probably a basket. She looked up, smiled, and waved. He dropped the wheel near the cart and kissed the top of his daughter's head. She smelled of sun and crushed grass. Later, after supper, he brought the cart into the small yard and placed the wheel carefully onto the broken axle. It fit snug, like it had always belonged there. He turned it once, and it spun smoothly, whispering in circles. His son clapped quietly. Before nightfall, he sat by the fire with a cup of warm milk and watched the flames curl upward. The shadows danced on the walls. A log cracked, sending a soft pop into the room like a tiny drum. He looked at his hands again. They had blisters now, one from the rope, another from tightening the wheel. But he didn't mind. They told a story, one of work, of effort, of something being done right. His wife lay down beside the children. They were already dreaming, He heard one mumble something about flying fish. He smiled, pulled the blanket up, and closed his eyes. Outside, the goats' bells jingled once, and then the village returned to silence. The rooster didn't crow that morning. Instead, it was the gentle clatter of pots that stirred the man from sleep. His wife was already up, standing near the small fire, carefully turning what looked like an oat cake over a flat stone. It hissed faintly, and the smell filled the air, a mix of warmth, grain, and something just slightly sweet. He sat up slowly. His legs ached, not sharply, but in a way that reminded him he had walked a long way yesterday. His wife handed him a small cup of warm water, with mint leaves floating in it. "You'll feel better," she said softly. Today was baking day. Not everyone baked their own bread in the village. In fact, most didn't. They brought their dough to the communal oven near the center of the village, where the oven master watched over the great round stone furnace, like a priest. It had been built years ago by a group of passing masons. No one remembered exactly when. The man wrapped a cloth around a ball of coarse dough that had been rising overnight in a wooden bowl. It was heavy, filled with crushed barley, a pinch of rye, and even a few hard bits of acorn flour to stretch it further. He tucked it under his arm and stepped outside. The oven stood near the well. It was shaped like a great dome, darkened with soot, and had a thick iron door that always creaked, no matter how much oil was used. A long line of people had already gathered. Some stood in silence. Others chatted quietly about the weather, the sheep that had wandered into someone else's plot, or the strange animal tracks spotted near the stream. The man waited patiently. When his turn came, he handed his dough to the oven master, who inspected it like a judge inspecting a painting. He nodded, marked a tiny line into the crust with a stick, and slid it inside using a long wooden paddle. "Back in a few hours," he said. So the man wandered. The market square nearby was quiet today. A woman sold small bundles of herbs, dried thyme, lavender and rosemary tied with bits of string. Another sold eggs, brown and speckled, still with a bit of straw clinging to them. He bought one and tucked it into his pouch. It would be a treat later. Beyond the market was the tannery. He didn't go near it. The smell was too much. Even from a distance, the air turned sour. A boy came running from that direction, with a cloth tied around his nose, carrying a pail of something thick and dark. Back in the garden beside his home, the man picked weeds from the carrot rows. His fingers sank into the earth, warm from the sun and soft with last week's rain. Worms curled lazily away from his touch. He found a small beetle with a shiny red shell and watched it climb a blade of grass. He heard his daughter giggling nearby. She was playing with sticks, pretending they were people. One was a knight, another was a lady. They danced, then fought, then sat together like old friends. By midday he returned to the oven. His bread was done, round, hard on the outside, but warm in the middle. The oven master wrapped it in a bit of cloth and handed it to him with a nod. He carried it home like it was treasure. Lunch was simple: a slice of bread, a piece of salted cheese, and the egg he had bought, now boiled in a pot over the fire. His children tore pieces of the bread and dipped them into the yolk, licking their fingers afterward with tiny smiles. After they ate, he repaired the fence. A few boards had come loose near the goat pen. He fetched his tools: a small hammer, a handful of bent nails, and a piece of twine for the parts too stubborn to stay straight. As he worked, the sun moved across the sky slowly, casting long shadows from the tree. Bees buzzed near the lavender bush, and a bird with blue feathers landed on the fence post for a moment, before darting off again. He wiped sweat from his brow. The fence held. In the evening his wife lit a small tallow candle, and read a bit from the single page they owned from an old psalter. She didn't know all the words, but she had memorized the parts that mattered. Her voice was soft, slow, careful. The children sat around her, half listening, half dreaming. The man leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs and watching the flame flicker. Outside, the world turned blue. That time of day, when it isn't quite night, but it's not day anymore. When the colors go quiet, he stepped outside briefly. The village was still, the smoke from chimneys rose straight up, almost not moving. A dog barked once in the distance, then stopped. The sky was filled with soft stars, barely visible but enough to remind you they were always there. He breathed deeply. The night was cool again, but not cold, just cool enough to wrap a blanket around your shoulders and feel grateful. He went back inside, climbed into bed, and closed his eyes. The bread would last 2 days. The fence would hold for a week. The mint in the cup still tasted faint on his tongue, and the stars kept watching. The next morning, clouds hung low over the village. The air felt heavy, not with storm, but with the sort of grayness that stretches across the sky like a worn wool blanket. It was the kind of weather that made people speak more softly, and made even the animals seem quieter than usual. The man rose as the pale light came in through the cracks in the wooden shutter. His wife was still asleep, curled under a woven cover. He carefully stepped over the squeaky board on the floor, and tiptoed outside. The dew on the grass clung to his shoe. He walked slowly, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The sound of morning was gentle, soft clucks from the chickens, the distant groan of someone moving a cart, a faint sniffle from a child in a nearby cottage. He didn't go to the fields right away. Instead, he made his way to the stream. It was a slow-moving stretch of water, bordered with mossy stones and tall grass. Frogs clung to the mud along the edges, and dragonflies hovered above, their wings catching the faintest light. He knelt at the water's edge and splashed a bit onto his face. It was cold but refreshing. He drank a few sips from his cupped hands. It tasted of earth and metal, the way water often did here. Beside the stream, an old willow tree leaned toward the water. Its branches dangled like curtains. He stood there for a moment, brushing his fingers along the hanging leaves. It reminded him of nothing in particular, just a feeling, a memory without shape. By the time he returned home, the fire was crackling again, and the children were sitting cross-legged, rubbing their eyes. His wife handed him a bit of leftover bread and some soft cheese wrapped in a leaf. "Rain's coming," she said, glancing out the window. "You should see if the thatch above the sleeping space needs patching." He nodded. The roof had been slowly wearing away. Thatch wasn't forever. Birds pulled out the straw for their nests, and heavy winds loosened bundles, until they sagged and leaked. Last week, a drop had landed right on his forehead in the middle of the night. Climbing up to the roof was not easy. The ladder was old and creaked with every step, but once he was up there, the village looked strange, flatter, wider. He could see over the tops of the trees, across the fields, and even catch glimpses of the castle wall far in the distance, like a gray line on the horizon. He pulled a bundle of dry straw from a sack and pushed it into the weak spot. He pressed it down, twisting and tucking, until the hole was filled. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for now. Later in the day, the village reeve passed by. He wore a dark cloak, dusty from travel, and carried a long staff with a copper band around the top. The reeve's job was to oversee the fields, and make sure everyone had paid their dues, either in coins, which most didn't have, or with their share of grain, wool or labor. The reeve didn't stop to talk. He never did. He simply nodded and moved on. The man checked the fence again. A new goat had arrived from the neighboring farm, and was testing the limits. It pushed its head against the boards with a stubbornness only goats possess. He tied a length of rope from one post to another, just enough to discourage the animal. Later, he joined his neighbor to cut firewood. The forest edge was only a short walk away. Trees lined the path like tall watchers, their bark damp with mist, and their roots covered in mushrooms and moss. They found a few fallen branches, and began to chop them into manageable pieces. The axe was dull. Each swing was more of a thud than a slice. But it worked. Slowly, carefully, they filled a small cart with thick logs and thinner sticks for kindling. On the walk back they talked, not about much, just small things. A new baby born in the village. The chickens, not laying well this season. The strange mark found near the path, possibly from a wild boar. At home, the firewood was stacked carefully against the wall, just under the small overhang that kept it dry. In the evening, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Clouds folded over one another like heavy blankets, and the wind began to hum low through the trees. Inside, the family sat closer to the fire than normal. The youngest child huddled beside her older sister, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide from the distant rumble of thunder. The man sang a song, not loudly, and not for performance. It was just a quiet melody he remembered from his mother, who had learned it from her, a song about stars and goats and warm milk and grass. Nonsense words and gentle rhythm. The rain came suddenly, first a tap on the roof, then a soft patter, then the full sound of it, steady, rolling, like someone pouring pebbles across the house. It was loud, but not frightening, just steady and deep. They watched it through the narrow gap in the shutter. Tiny rivers began to form in the dirt paths outside, and the plants danced in the downpour. The man placed a pot near the corner of the room to catch any stray drip. The patch had mostly. As night grew deeper, the fire dimmed, and the rains softened. The family lay down under their blankets. The man's wife ran her fingers slowly through the girl's hair, until her eyes closed. The older boy mumbled something in his sleep about a horse. The rain never stopped, but it became part of the silence. Outside, the goats had taken shelter under the overhang. The chickens huddled close in their coop. The forest slept, and the man closed his eyes, listening to the gentle rhythm of water tapping on wood, the soft breath of his wife beside him, and the warm weight of blankets pulled to his chin. He dreamed of nothing and everything. The rain had softened by morning, but the air was still heavy. It smelled like wet grass and damp earth, like wood that had been soaked and left to rest. The puddles that had formed along the dirt paths had become little mirrors, still and perfect, reflecting the slow-moving sky. The man woke earlier than usual. His shoulder ached a little from the work on the roof the day before, and his back felt stiff. But he didn't complain. That wasn't how things worked here. Complaints were for thoughts, not for voices. He dressed slowly, trying not to wake the others. The fire had burned low again, and the room was a bit cold. The floor felt rough beneath his feet. Outside, the sky was still gray, but brighter now, and the fields shimmered with a soft mist that hovered just above the ground. He checked the animals first. The goats were fine, muddy but dry. They bleated softly, already eager for feed. He spread a handful of hay for them, and checked the fence once more. The rope he'd tied yesterday had held. The new goats stared at him with slow, blank eyes. The chickens were muddier. He opened their coop and let them out. They shook off the water and wandered about, pecking at little bits of seed and tiny worms unearthed by the rain. Breakfast was plain, a bit of porridge cooked over the rekindled fire, with a splash of milk that had started to turn just slightly sour. Not spoiled, but sharp. The children didn't seem to mind. They were used to flavors changing with time. Later that morning, the village bell rang. It wasn't loud, just a soft, uneven clang from the bell tower near the center of the village. When the bell rang like that, it usually meant something needed attention. It wasn't an emergency, but it was something shared. The man left his cottage and followed the small crowd toward the village green. A group had gathered near the wooden post, where notices were sometimes nailed. The bailiff stood nearby, wearing a thick wool cloak and leather boots that sunk slightly into the mud. He spoke slowly, with pauses. There would be a visit from the Lord's steward in the coming day. He would be arriving to check on the grain stores, to collect certain dues, and to inspect the state of the land. The steward was not the Lord, but he carried his voice, and his mood could shape a day like wind shapes grass. The villagers didn't speak much. They listened, nodded, and slowly drifted away in pairs and threes, their thoughts already turning toward what needed doing before the steward arrived. The man stayed back for a moment. He looked at the post where the notice had been nailed. It was written in a script he couldn't read. He had never learned letters, but the way it curled and slanted made it look almost beautiful. Back home, He spoke to his wife. She nodded. They would need to clean the front of the house, repair a bit of the outer wall that had sagged after the last windstorm, and gather any stored grain into the small sacks they used when the steward came. It was important to appear orderly, even if nothing was ever truly perfect. The children helped. They picked up sticks and bits of straw that had blown around. The older boy helped move a heavy stone that had shifted near the edge of the path. The girl carried small bundles of dry moss to be used later for kindling. Even the chickens seemed to behave that day, staying near the coop and out of the way. By noon, the sun had peeked out. It warmed the village just enough that the mud began to firm, and a few people took off their cloaks for the first time in days. The man sat for a moment outside, letting the light hit his face. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but just to feel. A shadow passed. It was the neighbor, an old man with a bent back and a calm voice. He asked if the man wanted to join him on a short walk to the old stones at the edge of the woods. They had no real reason to go, other than to stretch their legs and see how the world had changed after the rain. The walk was slow. They didn't speak for long stretches, only now and then about a tree that had fallen, or mushrooms that had popped up overnight. The forest smelled green and deep. Water dripped from leaves like quiet applause. When they reached the stones, they sat on one. No one knew who had placed the stones there. They were old, older than memory, older than the village. Some people said they were left by giants. Others said druids, though no one quite knew what druids were anymore. The stones were cool to the touch and covered in moss. They sat there for a long while. The old man spoke of his wife, long gone now, and of the spring when the river had flooded the lower fields. The man listened, nodded, and said little. Sometimes listening was enough. When they returned, the air had shifted again, cooler now, and breezy. The kind of breeze that made leaves flutter but didn't bend the trees. The man's wife had laid out some herbs to dry near the hearth, and the smell of thyme and rosemary filled the house. They ate supper earlier that evening. Barley stew with bits of root, vegetables, soft and sweet from slow cooking. A sliver of salted pork had been saved from the last market trip, and was sliced thinly, almost transparently, and added to the pot. The children ate hungrily. After dinner, the family sat together near the fire again. No one spoke much. They were simply there, listening to the gentle crackling of the fire, and the sound of the wind, pushing softly against the side of the house. The man pulled out a small wooden carving from a pouch. It was a bird, not quite finished, with one wing still rough. He worked slowly, scraping with a thin blade, pausing now and then to blow away the shavings. The girl watched, her eyes wide and curious. He would finish it soon, but not tonight. The fire dimmed, and the children curled together under a blanket. The boy whispered something about wanting to learn to carve one day. The man nodded, and smiled without showing his teeth. Outside, the night was clear. For the first time in days, the stars were visible, tiny, cold, and countless. The village slept, wrapped in its usual silence. And the man, tired in a good way, stretched out his legs, placed the unfinished bird on the shelf, and closed his eyes. He didn't think about the steward. He didn't worry about the coming week. For now, there was the warmth of the fire, the breathing of his family, and the way the house creaked gently, like an old friend shifting in its sleep. Morning came quietly. No rooster crowed. The chickens rustled softly, but even they seemed to know it was too early to be loud. The house was still wrapped in half-darkness, and the fire was nothing but a glow buried in ash. The man stirred slowly. His back hurt less than usual. That was a small blessing. His hands were dry and cracked, though calluses rough against the blanket as he pushed it aside. He looked out the small window, squinting into the grayish light. Today, he had to go to the mill. The last of their grain, from the storage jar, had been scraped for yesterday's stew. There was more barley in the small wooden sock, tied tightly and stored above the floor, to keep it away from damp and mice. It was time to carry it. The mill was not far, just across 2 fields, past the stream that sometimes overflowed, but the walk was slow, especially with a heavy sack. He dressed carefully, The morning was cold again, not biting, but damp and deep. The kind of cold that seeps under your skin if you ignore it. He wrapped a woolen cloth around his neck and picked up the sack of grain. His wife handed him a crust of bread, left over from yesterday. She had softened it in warm water and wrapped it in cloth. Something to chew on later if he got hungry. He nodded thanks and stepped out into the quiet. The grass was wet. Each blade shimmered with dew, and the tips brushed against his boots, darkening the leather. Birds were starting to move now, blackbirds mostly, flickering through the hedges. They were already searching for worms and seeds. He took his time. The path to the mill passed by the edge of the commons, where sheep grazed, and where sometimes the children chased each other in the afternoon sun. But today it was empty. Just a few goats off in the distance, nibbling moss from rocks. As he neared the stream, he paused. The water was higher than usual, swollen from the week's rain. Not dangerous, but enough that he had to step carefully along the stone path to avoid slipping. He balanced the sack on his shoulder and crossed one foot at a time. The mill came into view. It was a large stone building, with a sloped wooden roof, and a big water wheel on the side. The wheel turned slowly, powered by the steady flow of the stream that ran beneath it. The sound of creaking wood and rushing water filled the air. Inside, the miller was already at work. He was a thick man, with strong arms and a dusting of flour always clinging to his clothes. His voice was deep, but quiet, almost as if the walls around him asked for calm. The man nodded politely, and set the grain down. The miller opened the sack, checked the contents, and gave a small grunt of approval. It would be enough for flour. Enough for maybe a week or more depending on how they used it. The grinding would take time. While he waited, the man stepped outside and sat on a stump. He chewed slowly on the bread his wife had given him. It was chewy and tough, but he liked the way it tasted, sour and earthy. From where he sat, he could see the wheel turning, the water catching the blades again and again. Another man came to the mill just after, a neighbor younger than him, but with a limp in one leg from a fall during last year's harvest. They talked for a while about how the trees near the edge of the forest were growing crooked this year, and how the sky had a strange yellow hue just before dawn. Then the miller called out. The flour was ready. He tied it neatly in a fresh sack, smaller now of course. What was once heavy barley grain was now pale, fine flour ready to be turned into bread, dumplings or porridge. The man paid the miller, not in coin, they had little use for that, but with a promise of help fixing the barn roof before the month was out. The miller agreed. That was how things worked here. On the way home, the air began to change. The sun pushed through the clouds in thin beams, lighting patches of grass so brightly it looked almost silver. The man stopped for a moment and let it warm his face. There were birds singing now, not loud, but steady. It made the world feel softer. Back at the house, the children were gathering wood. His wife had scrubbed the front wall clean with sand and lye, and the doorway looked brighter now. She smiled when she saw the flour sack. Later that afternoon, they made bread. The smell filled the house, yeasty and warm, with that hint of smoke from the fire. The children waited, barely able to sit still. They always got excited when bread was fresh. When it was ready, they ate slowly. No butter, no jam, just warm slices with a little salt, a little oil. It was enough. The youngest child held his piece with both hands like it was treasure. After they ate, they played a quiet game. It was simple, just drawing lines in the ashes near the hearth, taking turns to make shapes and guess what each one was. A bird, a fish, a tree, a river. The boy drew a circle and called it the moon. The man smiled. Evening came like a soft sigh. The sky turned from silver to blue, then purple and finally to a warm deep gray. The animals had already been fed. The chickens settled into their coop, and the goats lay down in the corner of the pen. The fire crackled gently. The man carved again, this time the bird's other wing. He was almost finished now. The edges were smooth. The shape was taking form. His wife was sewing near the fire. She worked slowly, pulling the needle through wool, mending a tear in one of the children's cloaks. She didn't speak, and neither did he. There was peace in silence. Later, after the fire had dimmed, the man stepped outside. The air was cooler again, but not unpleasant. The stars were beginning to appear. He saw one blink, then another. A soft breeze stirred the trees. A candle flickered in a house nearby. He looked up at the sky for a long time. He wondered how many others were doing the same thing at that very moment. Not just in the village, but across the hills, across the land, looking at the same stars. The world felt both very large and very quiet. He returned inside, brushed the wood shavings from his hands, and crawled under the blanket next to his wife. The children were already asleep, breathing slowly, wrapped up in their own tiny dreams. And as the last embers glowed faintly orange, and the roof creaked ever so slightly in the cool air, the man closed his eyes. He didn't think of tomorrow, or taxes, or even the steward's visit. He just listened to the silence, and let himself rest. The wind had shifted by morning. Not a storm, nothing violent or noisy. Just that quiet breeze that hinted at a change. The man awoke slowly, blinking into a pale light. Outside, the air held that damp scent again, like the earth was thinking of rain. His back ached more than yesterday. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, before standing. The wooden floor was cool beneath his feet. He stepped carefully around the children, still curled in their blankets, like small animals in a nest. One of them snored softly. The man picked up the bucket and headed for the well. Drawing water was part of every morning. The well sat near the center of the village, surrounded by worn earth and stone. The walk there was quiet. Only a few others were out, mostly women, with baskets, or men with ropes over their shoulders, ready for a long day ahead. At the well, the crank creaked as he turned it. The rope was damp and rough in his hands. The bucket sank, filled with a heavy splash, and then slowly rose again. He poured the water into a clay jar, and nodded to the woman waiting behind him. She nodded back, but didn't speak. No one talked much in the early hours. The man made his way home. The jar balanced carefully in his arms. His wife was already lighting the fire again. She sprinkled dry moss and bark at the base, and leaned in close to breathe gently. A small flame licked upward. Breakfast was quiet again, just bread and a few boiled herbs. The children ate sleepily, their eyes still puffy. The man's daughter yawned with her mouth wide open, and then giggled behind her hands. Her mother scolded her gently, but she smiled too. It was going to be a long day. The steward's men were coming. Once a month, the Lord sent men to the village, to inspect, to ask questions, and sometimes to take things. Everyone knew to tidy their homes, to stand straight, to be respectful, not fearful, exactly, but never fully relaxed. The man stepped outside again after eating. He washed his hands in the cold water from the jar, and combed his hair with his fingers. Then he helped his wife sweep the packed dirt floor smooth. The children gathered their things quickly. No one wanted to be caught unprepared. There was a knock on the door just before midday. Two men stood outside. One was younger, the other older. They wore dark cloaks and carried small leather pouches. The younger one held a wooden tablet with a list of names scratched into it. The older man looked around the room slowly, his eyes never pausing for long. They asked questions. How many animals? How much grain? Had any pigs died this season? Were their tools needing repair? Was the roof sound? The man answered honestly. He didn't lie. There was no point. He said the chickens had stopped laying as many eggs. He said the goat had hurt its leg, but was still walking. He said the plow blade was dull, but he hoped to borrow a file from the neighbor. The men nodded, and made notes. They took a small portion of dried peas from the storage pot, part of the tax, just a few handfuls, enough to be noticed. Then they moved on to the next house. The man stood in the doorway for a while after they left. He didn't say anything. His wife didn't either. The house felt a little smaller. By late afternoon, things returned to normal. The children played outside again, careful not to shout. The man returned to his carving. The bird was almost finished now. Its beak had taken shape, and the wings had fine lines like feathers. He ran his finger along its side, smoothing the edges. He thought of his own father. He had carved things too. Not birds but animals. Horses. Mostly. The man remembered how quiet the house used to be when his father worked. The only sound was the scrape of knife on wood, and the occasional whistle from his lips. Later the man walked to the edge of the village. There was a tree there, older than any of the houses. Its trunk was wide and split down the middle, like two trees had grown into one. Beneath it, the ground was covered in moss, soft green and cool. He sat there for a while. The sun was lower now. Orange light slipped through the branches and lit the moss in small patches. He leaned against the tree and looked out at the fields. The wheat was growing taller. The wind made it ripple like water. A small bird landed nearby. Not the kind he had carved, but similar. It hopped across the ground, picking at something hidden in the grass. Its feathers shone in the sunlight, and its head tilted as if it were listening. The man smiled. He stayed there until the light began to fade. Evening came without warning. By the time he returned home, the fire was going again. The house smelled of stew, simple, made from dried beans, onions and a few herbs. His wife handed him a bowl and he sat near the fire to eat. The children listened to a story. Their mother told it slowly, in the old way, the words gentle and familiar. It was about a girl who turned into a deer and ran through the forest for 100 years, before becoming human again. The story didn't make much sense, but it didn't need to. It was soft, dreamlike. The man rested his eyes while he listened. He wasn't asleep, not fully, just resting, letting the sound of the voice carry him like a current in a stream. The fire popped once. The youngest child jumped a little and then laughed. The man opened his eyes again, and saw the bird carving resting beside the fire. Its wings caught the flicker of light, and cast long shadows on the floor. Before bed he stepped outside once more. The stars were thick tonight. Dozens, maybe hundreds, like tiny holes poked in the sky. The air was colder now, and the village was almost completely silent. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, then nothing. He walked a little way down the path, just to feel the air, just to breathe without a roof above. He thought about the steward's visit again, and how little they had taken. He was grateful. Some months, it was worse. He stopped by the tree once more. It looked different at night. Bigger. The moss shimmered faintly under the starlight. He touched the bark and felt the ridges under his fingers. Then he turned back. When he returned home, the fire was almost out. His wife was already lying down. The children were asleep again. One of them curled into the other like kittens. The house smelled of smoke and wood and bread. He lay down and closed his eye. The bird carving rested beside the hearth, its shadow long and still. The wind moved outside, but gently, like it was tired too. And the man let himself drift. The sound of soft rain woke him before the first light of day. It wasn't loud or harsh, just a gentle tapping on the roof, like fingers drumming on old wood. The man opened his eyes slowly and listened. Rain could mean 100 different things in the village. Sometimes it brought peace, other times it brought mud. He stretched carefully, his joints stiff. The fire had burned out during the night. The room was cold and dim. He moved quietly around the children, who slept more soundly in the chill. His wife was already awake, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders as she stirred the embers. She didn't speak, but handed him a cloth. They both knew the roof would need checking. There was a spot near the corner where water liked to slip in, just a thin line of it, dripping quietly down the inside wall. He picked up a stool and placed it beneath the beam, then climbed up slowly, pressing his fingers against the damp wood. It wasn't too bad. Not yet. He pulled a scrap of wool from a bundle nearby and tucked it gently along the seam, just enough to stop the drip, just enough to make the morning quiet again. Outside the village shimmered. Everything was darker and softer. The soil looked rich and black, and puddles formed along the worn paths. Children's footprints were still visible in the mud from the day before. Smoke curled slowly from a few chimneys. The man stepped out beneath the eaves, watching the drizzle fall in crooked lines. He didn't mind the rain. Not really. It soaked the earth and gave the herbs a chance to grow. It softened the air. It made things slow down. He walked toward the shed beside the house. It was more a shelter than a building. Just a few planks of wood, nailed together, but enough to keep the tools dry. Inside, the man pulled out the hoe and a small spade. He needed to dig around the roots of the turnips. Too much water and they could rot. The garden was slick and quiet. He worked slowly, his boots sinking just slightly into the ground. The smell of wet leaves and soil filled the air. A few birds chirped from somewhere far off, and a rooster crowed faintly through the drizzle. He dug carefully, not too deep, just enough to let the water drain. His hands were cold, but the work warmed him a little. By the time he finished, the drizzle had turned to mist. It hung in the air like breath on a cold morning. Back inside, the children had woken. They sat in a row, each with a piece of bread, dipping it into warm milk from the pot. One of them made a face and tried to feed hers to the dog, who sniffed it and walked away. The van chuckled softly and tousled her hair. The rest of the morning passed slowly. His wife spun wool by the fire, the spindle turning smoothly in her hand. The children played a quiet game with pebbles and string. The man sat on his stool and carved another piece of wood. Not a bird this time, but a small fox. Its ears were pointed, its tail curled. Later he visited the neighbor. The man next door was older, with thick gray eyebrows and a voice like gravel. He sat on a stool just outside his door, a cloak draped over his shoulders. "Too much rain," he muttered as the younger man approached. "Enough for the turnips," the man said softly. The neighbor nodded, then motioned to the sky. "Won't last though. Never does." They talked a while about nothing much. About the hens, the weather, the steward's visit. The older man had a cracked mug in his hand, filled with something warm. He offered the younger man a sip, and he took it gratefully. It was a quiet kind of companionship. No stories, no loud laughter. Just two people sitting in the rain, saying almost nothing. When the man returned home, the rain had the clouds were still thick, but the air smelled different. Fresh, the kind of clean that only comes after a good rain. The roof still dripped gently, but not as much. He picked up his cloak and walked toward the woods. Not far, just to the edge. There was a path there, soft with moss and lined with wild flowers. His feet made almost no sound as he walked. Birds fluttered between the trees, and the occasional squirrel darted across his path. He collected herbs, yarrow, mugwort, and chickweed plants his wife used for teas and salves. She had taught him how to find them, what to pick, and what to leave. He carried a small sack and filled it slowly, picking only what was needed. Deeper into the woods, the sounds changed. No more distant voices, no more dogs barking, just the rustle of trees, and the occasional crack of a twig. He stopped by a stream and knelt to wash his hands. The water was icy, but it felt good. He sat there for a while, watching the water slide over the stones. There were fish in it, tiny ones, barely longer than his finger. They darted back and forth like quick thoughts. He smiled, remembering how he used to try catching them as a child. Never once had he succeeded. On the way home he found a feather, long, gray, and perfect. He slipped it into his belt and kept walking. By the time he returned, the clouds had begun to break. Sunlight spilled across the village in thin beams, lighting the thatch roofs and making the puddles shimmer like coin. Children laughed as they splashed each other. Someone beat a rug with a stick just outside their door. Inside, the house was warmer. His wife was boiling water in a clay pot, and the children had stacked small wooden pieces into a tower that leaned slightly to one side. The fox carving rested on the shelf beside the bird, its eyes still rough and unshaped. That evening, the family ate vegetable stew again. It wasn't fancy, just what they had. But the warmth of it filled the house, and the sound of spoons against bowls was comforting in its own way. Before bed, the man gave his daughter the feather. She looked at it with wide eyes, and ran her fingers over it again and again. "What kind of bird?" she asked softly. "Not sure," he said. "One that flies far." She smiled, and tucked it under her blanket. Later, when everyone had settled, the man sat by the fire one last time. The flames flickered against the walls, casting soft shadows that swayed like tall grass. He picked up the fox again, and began carving its eyes, slowly, carefully. The knife moved in tiny arcs, just enough to shape a gaze. Outside, the night was quiet again. The stars were faint tonight, hidden behind lingering clouds, but a breeze moved gently through the village. It carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, the kind of air that made you want to wrap yourself in something warm and just listen. The man set down the carving and lay on his mat. His bones ached less tonight. Maybe it was the rain, maybe it was the quiet, or maybe, just maybe, it was that things had been simple today, not easy, but simple. And as he drifted off, he thought of the fox's eyes, the mossy path, and the feel of cold stream water between his fingers. And then sleep. The morning came quietly. No roosters crowed this time, no loud clatter or voices from outside, just the sound of the wind, gently moving across the thatched roof, and brushing against the walls like a soft broom. Inside, the man stirred beneath his rough wool blanket, blinked at the pale light seeping in through the wooden slats, and sighed softly. His back ached today. Not sharply, just that dull, familiar kind of tiredness that had settled into his bones over the years. He sat up slowly, rubbed his hands together for warmth, and reached for his boots. They were still damp from the day before. The children slept a little longer now that the weather was cold. It took them more time to wake up when the world felt like a stone under the clouds. His wife was already up, again silent as usual this early, heating up some leftover broth, and spreading lard onto hard bread. The man didn't speak, but nodded his thanks. The fire crackled in its place, warming the clay walls just enough to push the chill back. He held the bread in both hands and ate slowly. The broth wasn't much, but it filled the stomach and gave him enough strength to begin the day. Today was market day, not the grand kind with brightly painted signs or loud shouting sellers, just the village market. A gathering of people, who brought what little they had to trade. A few jars of honey, some dried herbs, rough cloth, bundles of onions, or maybe a hen if someone was lucky. The man stood up and checked the few items they could spare. He had some carved pieces, animals mostly, the small fox from before, a rough sheep, a bird with 2 short wings. His wife had a bundle of dried mint and wormwood, tied neatly with twine. She had also baked a few flat loaves the day before. He packed everything carefully into a sack made from an old apron, tied it tight, and slung it over his shoulder. His wife handed him a small pouch. It wasn't heavy. Inside were 2 buttons, a bit of wax, and 1 silver coin worn nearly smooth. The pouch had been passed down for years, rarely opened, but always kept, just in case. He stepped out into the morning air. It was cool, but not cold. The sun hadn't fully come up yet. Just a hint of golden light through the gray sky. The air smelled of earth, and smoke, and something faintly sweet, like apples, though he didn't know where from. The path to the market was muddy again. His boots sank slightly with each step. The mud clung to the edges, and made small slurping sounds as he walked. He passed neighbors, each carrying something. A bundle of wool, a small basket of eggs, a wooden bucket filled with turnips. No one said much, just quiet nods and tired eyes. The market was held near the chapel. It wasn't a grand church, just a stone building with a crooked bell and ivy creeping up the side. A few worn wooden tables had been set up, though most people laid their goods on cloths spread out across the ground. The man found a spot near a group, selling pottery, and spread his carvings neatly in a row. He sat beside them and watched the people move. A woman with braids was selling soup in small wooden cups. A boy nearby played a flute with only one note. An old man tried to sell spoons, though no one seemed to need one. There was a girl holding a basket of feathers, each one tied with string. It was slow. People didn't have much to trade, and most didn't have anything to spare. Still, one woman picked up the fox carving and asked the man if it was magic. He shook his head, but smiled. She traded a small ball of spun wool for it, and walked away with the fox in her pocket. By midday he had traded most of the items. He now carried a small piece of beeswax, a chunk of dried meat, and a threadbare scarf. He was about to leave when a man in finer clothes stopped beside him. The man was tall, with gloves and a fur-lined cap. He looked down at the carvings and picked up the bird. "This one's not done," he said. "No," the man replied. "Wings came out wrong." The tall man turned the bird over in his hands. "I like it," he said after a moment. "How much?" The man paused. "You can have it." The tall man looked surprised, then nodded once, handed over a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, and walked away. The man watched him go. Sometimes the market gave you what you needed. Other times, it gave you something you didn't expect, like a strange man who liked a broken. On the way back, the man stopped by the well. He dropped the bucket and listened to the splash, then pulled it up slowly. The water was cold and clear. He took a few sips, wiped his mouth, and continued home. When he arrived, his wife was tending to the garden. The children were chasing each other around the trees, yelling something about monsters and kings. One of them held a stick like a sword. The youngest wore a crown made from twisted grass. He gave his wife the scarf and the cheese. She smiled and wrapped the scarf around her neck. Even though it was too short, the cheese they would save for a special meal, maybe when the steward came again, or maybe just one quiet evening. That night, as the sky turned to silver, the man sat outside. He looked up at the stars. They were scattered across the sky like seeds, glowing gently. Some were brighter than others. Some seemed to move, if you stared too long. The moon was barely a sliver. His wife brought out a cup of warm drink. Not ale, just hot water with herbs. She sat beside him and neither spoke. They just listened to the wind, the distant crackle of someone else's fire, and the slow rhythm of the world. He thought again about the market. The girl with the feathers, the boy with the flute, the man who liked broken birds. He reached into his pocket and found a small carving he hadn't sold. A tiny horse, no bigger than his thumb. Its legs were uneven, but the face was kind. He placed it beside him on the bench, and then as the night deepened and the air grew colder, he leaned back, pulled his cloak around his shoulders, and closed his eyes. The stars blinked slowly above. The world didn't rush, and everything, for that moment, was still. The next morning arrived slowly. A gentle fog had covered the village, like a soft gray blanket. Everything outside looked a little blurred. The trees were quieter than usual, the birds not as loud. Even the footsteps of people walking to their morning tasks sounded softer somehow. It was one of those mornings where time didn't seem to hurry at all. Inside the small home, the man was already awake. He had been lying still for a while, staring at the wooden beams above him, listening to the steady breathing of his wife, and the soft shifting sounds of the children still asleep. His back still ached. So did his knee. But he had long stopped complaining about these things. It was just part of living now. He sat up and stretched, slowly, carefully. His breath came out in small clouds, and the chill made his hands stiff. He wrapped the old wool cloak around himself before walking to the fire, where just a few faint embers still glowed. He poked them gently, added a few twigs, and watched as the flames woke up like sleepy eyes. His wife stirred not long after. She rose, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and began preparing something warm for the children. The man helped her without speaking. They moved in silence, but with practiced understanding. A small pot of porridge was set to cook, and the scent of oats began to fill the air. Today was repair day. That's what he called it. There were no fields to work today, no market to attend, no steward visits. just a long list of things around the home and small land that needed fixing. The fence had a few broken pieces. The door creaked badly when the wind blew. One of the stools had a cracked leg. And the roof, he sighed, was letting in water near the back corner again. He pulled on his boots, tied them tight, and stepped outside. The fog was still thick. The ground was damp, but not muddy. As he walked toward the fence, he noticed the neighbor's boy trying to patch up a coop where chickens had escaped the day before. The man raised a hand in greeting. The boy nodded, then dropped his hammer. The fence wasn't too bad. Some of the wooden slats had become loose. Others were simply crooked. He picked up a few nails he had saved in a little jar and began tapping them in carefully. The rhythm of the hammering was slow and steady. He liked it that way. It made the thoughts in his head settle down. Once the fence was fixed, he moved to the stool. He brought it out into the light, sat down beside it, and examined the cracked leg. He traced the break with his thumb and remembered when he first built it. Many winters ago, before their second child was born. He pulled some scrap wood from the pile near the shed, shaped a replacement piece, and began smoothing it with a dull blade. It took time, but he wasn't in a hurry. By midday the stool stood again without wobbling. He tested it with his weight, and then brought it back inside, and placed it next to the hearth. His wife gave him a smile. Lunch was simple, just leftover porridge with a bit of wild herbs mixed in. The children had already eaten, and were playing outside, their laughter drifting through the cracks of the door. One of them had tied a stick to a rope, and called it a horse. Another was pretending to be a merchant, selling stones as silver. After eating, the man stood and picked up a ladder. The roof was always the hardest. He leaned the ladder against the rear wall and climbed slowly. The wooden rungs creaked under his weight, but held. Once on the roof, he crouched low and began checking for soft spots. He found two near the corner where the chimney sloped. The straw had come loose, and rain had soaked through. He pulled some new bundles of thatch from the pile they kept under a canvas, and began weaving them into place. His fingers were cold and stiff. Bits of straw kept getting into his sleeves. A bird flew nearby and startled him for a moment, but then it landed in a tree and watched in silence. The man kept working, patched, twisted, tied, one bundle at a time. By the time he climbed down, the sky had darkened a bit. He wiped his hands on his cloak, and sat down on the bench outside. The bench where the little carved horse still sat. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and thought about fixing the uneven legs, but then he smiled and placed it back. Inside, the fire was burning strong again. The children were helping to peel some turnips. His wife was grinding dried herbs with a stone. The smell of rosemary floated in the air. That evening, a traveler passed by. It didn't happen often. He wore a brown cloak, and carried a bundle on his back. He asked for a place to rest. The man nodded and offered a stool by the fire. His wife ladled out a bit of soup. They asked no question, just gave him warmth and food. The traveler spoke softly. He had come from a far-off village, across the hills and rivers. He spoke of a place where people built their homes from stone shaped like perfect squares, of a woman who had woven cloth so fine it looked like of a man who could write with both hands at the same time. The children listened wide-eyed. The man just nodded, listening more to the tone than the words. The soft voice, the quiet crackle of the fire, the way the world seemed slower when people shared stories. Later they made space for the traveler to sleep near the fire. He wrapped himself in his cloak, and sighed deeply. The man lay down beside his wife, and watched the flicker of firelight dance across the ceiling. The day had been full of small tasks, nothing grand, nothing loud, just one little thing after another. But somehow it felt like enough. Outside, the fog had returned. It crept over the trees and fields like a ghost without sound. The stars were hidden now, but he knew they were still there, just waiting, just glowing quietly above the clouds. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he heard was a soft wind brushing the roof above. Not leaking, not creaking, just quiet. The next day began with the sound of soft rain. It wasn't the kind of storm that made windows rattle or roofs groan. It was gentle, like a quiet tapping against the earth, like the sky whispering to the land. Drops slipped from the edge of the roof, one after another, landing in tiny puddles outside the door. The man listened for a while before opening his eyes. He always woke before the others, not because he had to, but because his mind rarely slept deeply anymore. It moved like an old wheel, slowly, creaking, never fully stopping. Even when the night was calm, he sat up and stretched again. His arms felt heavier today, maybe from the roof work, maybe from the weight of everything else, but he didn't complain. There were still things to be done. Quietly, he pulled on his tunic and tied the string near his neck. It was damp from where it had hung near the door. As he stepped out, the cold kissed his cheeks. The fog from the day before was gone, but the sky was still a smooth sheet of gray. The air smelled of wet grass, damp earth, and old wood. Across the village, people were slower than usual. They moved under cloaks and hoods, heads lowered. The man walked to the edge of the path and checked the ditch beside it. It was filling with rainwater again. He grabbed a spade and began digging a little channel to guide the water away from the path. Not because someone told him to, just because it needed doing. That's how most things were in this time. No one kept long to-do lists or had neat calendars. People simply did what was needed when it showed itself. After a while, his neighbor came by. A small woman with a crooked back and sharp eyes. She carried a basket with old cloth strips and asked if his wife had any thread to spare. He nodded and invited her in. The two women spoke softly for a while. They traded thread for a bit of dried mint. Nothing big, but valuable to both. By mid-morning, the man set out toward the forest edge. He needed more firewood. He took his axe and a rope bundle. The path to the forest was muddy, and his boots sank with every few steps. But the trees offered cover, and the deeper he walked, the drier the ground became. The forest was quiet today. Only the sound of the rain dripping from leaves and the occasional flap of wings disturbed the stillness. He walked between the tall trunks, looking for branches that had already fallen, or trees that were near the end. They didn't cut living ones, unless they had to. He found a tall, slender tree with a slight lean. He paused, placed a hand on its bark, then began swinging the axe. Not quickly, not forcefully, just rhythmically. The thud of metal against wood echoed softly through the trees. With every strike, a small puff of damp wood scent rose into the air. When it finally fell, it did so slowly. There was no great crash, no birds scattered, just a gentle creaking, and a soft thump as it landed on moss. He cut it into pieces, tied them with rope, and began the walk back. Back in the village, smoke curled up from chimney holes. Lunch was already being prepared in many homes. The smell of onions, turnips, and a bit of salted meat drifted through the air. His stomach growled. He passed two boys wrestling in the mud, laughing, completely soaked. An old dog watched them from a dry patch under a cart, blinking slowly. He returned home just as the soup was being poured. His wife smiled and helped him unload the wood. The children gathered around the pot, holding wooden bowls. They sat close, shoulders touching, steam rising around their faces. There wasn't much talk, just eating and warmth. Later, the man sat down to repair a pair of sandals. They belonged to his youngest. The straps had broken, and the soles had worn thin. He stitched carefully with a curved bone needle, pushing the thread through leather that was rough and tired. He remembered when these sandals were new. His wife had made them. As he worked, the children played near the hearth. One was stacking stones, another was drawing shapes in the ash with a stick. The third kept asking questions about the stars, about sheep, about why trees bend but don't break. The man answered as best he could, sometimes with truth, sometimes with stories. As the day went on, the village began to prepare for a small gathering. Not a festival, just a meeting at the longhouse. Once or twice each month, people gathered to share news, offer goods, or simply be together. It wasn't official. There were no rulers here. No one demanded it. It was simply what they did. That evening, The man and his family walked through the wet grass, toward the longhouse. Others were already inside. Lanterns glowed against the dark wooden walls. The fire pit at the center burned gently. People sat on benches and logs, passing bowls of warm drink, bread, and dried berries. Someone had brought a bit of cheese. Someone else offered a folded bit of cloth she had woven herself. The talk was low and soft. Some spoke of how the last frost had come early. Others mentioned a wolf sighting near the creek. An older man told a story about a tree that had grown upside down, its roots reaching for the sky. Everyone laughed. Not because they believed it, just because it felt good. The man sat quietly, listening. His children lay on a blanket near the fire, already half asleep. His wife talked with a woman about dyeing fabrics with onion skins. He just sat, warming his hands on a cup of something hot, watching the fire dance. At one point a young man stood and played a soft tune on a flute. The notes rose and fell like a breeze over fields. No one spoke. No one moved much. They just listened. Even the children stopped fidgeting. The fire snapped gently in rhythm. When it was time to leave, the rain had stopped. The stars peeked through the clouds, blinking gently. The walk back was quiet, the ground still soft underfoot. The children were carried part of the way, sleepy and full. Their heads rested on shoulders. Their breaths were slow and deep. Inside the house the fire was still burning. The man placed a few pieces of the new wood on top. He watched the flames catch and flicker. His wife tucked the children into their shared bed. He sat on the stool he had repaired just the day before and stared into the firelight. Another day had passed. Nothing grand had happened. No battles, no feasts, no kings or castles. Just chores, simple gifts, quiet meals, and soft rain. But somehow that made it beautiful in its own way. He looked around the room. The worn walls, the sleeping children, the small bundle of herbs drying in the corner. The roof didn't leak tonight. The sandals were stitched. The fire was warm. And outside the stars had returned. Morning came slower than usual. There was no rooster crowing this time. No clang of iron or loud chatter in the distance. Just the soft stirring of blankets, and the creak of the wooden frame as the man sat up once more, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The house was still dim. Only a pale strip of light came through the wooden shutters. Not quite strong enough to wake the children yet. His wife stirred slightly but didn't speak. The coals in the hearth were still warm, faintly glowing, waiting for the day's first breath. The man reached for a log and placed it gently on the fading embers. It crackled a little, then slowly began to the scent of smoke returned, soft, woody, comforting. It was the scent of life in this age, of warmth, cooking, safety. He stepped outside with a quiet grunt and looked around. The rain had stopped completely. What it left behind was a soaked world, muddy ground, shining stones, and leaves dripping in silence. A few birds chirped lazily, shaking water from their feathers. In the distance the hills looked like soft gray shadows wrapped in morning fog. He picked up a small bucket and made his way to the well. His boots sank with each step, but he didn't mind. This was normal. He passed two girls carrying bundles of kindling. They nodded quietly. He nodded back. No words were needed. Everyone knew their place and purpose. He dropped the bucket into the well, and heard the satisfying splash far below. The rope creaked as he pulled it back up. Hand over hand, slow and steady. Water dripped from the sides. He poured it into a clay pot and began the slow walk back home, thinking about what needed to be done today. There was no calendar on the wall, no clock ticking. Time moved by the feel of the air, the sounds of birds, the angle of the sun. Today felt like a weaving day, not because it was special, but because it wasn't. No chores were too urgent, no roof needed fixing, no neighbor was in trouble, so the inside work could begin. Inside, his wife was already sorting wool. She had cleaned it the day before and set it out to dry near the fire. Now she was picking it apart, removing small bits of hay, burrs, and dried leaves. Her fingers moved with patience, never rushing. One of the children came to help. mimicking her actions. The man sat nearby and began carving. Not anything fancy, just a small spoon from a block of wood he'd found while chopping the tree last week. He held it carefully, shaping the bowl of the spoon with a small curved knife. The grain of the wood told him which way to cut. His strokes were slow, steady, quiet. Outside, a few villagers passed by. One was pushing a wheelbarrow of apples, some already turning soft. Another was leading a goat along a soggy path, trying to coax it forward with a handful of wilted earth. The village life moved like that, quiet, repetitive, yet full of tiny moments. Later, the man's neighbor came by again. This time she brought a spindle, a tool used to spin wool into thread. She showed the children how it worked. They watched closely, eyes wide as the wool twisted into a long, thin string. Their fingers reached for it, giggling as the spindle wobbled. The man smiled, not because anything was especially funny, just because it was peaceful, and in a place where peace was rare. These small things mattered more than gold or glory. The afternoon brought a visitor, a peddler. He came walking into the village from the muddy road, his cloak soaked near the bottom, his cart creaking behind him. He wasn't a stranger, not really. He came once every few months, bringing odd things, beads, candles, bits of colored cloth, maybe a needle or two. People gathered slowly. The man approached with 2 eggs and a handful of dried herbs. He traded them for a small comb and a piece of salt. His wife would be pleased. Salt was hard to come by without coin. It made food last longer. It made things taste real. The peddler shared stories too. He told of a village far to the south, where people built houses from stone alone, with roofs so thick not even the coldest wind could slip through. He spoke of a town with a river that ran red, not with blood but from clay in the soil. The villagers listened, as they always did. Stories were the thread that held their world together. That evening, the family worked together again. The man hollowed out another spoon. His wife spun thread. The children sorted dried beans into small clay pots. One of them hummed softly. The firelight painted slow-moving shadows on the wall. The pot on the hearth bubbled gently, boiling roots and dried onions into something warm. Dinner was quiet. The man gave thanks, not in words, but in silence. A glance upward, a slow breath, a stillness of heart. The family ate together, dipped pieces of bread into the stew, then leaned back against the wall. No one said much. They didn't need to. Afterward, the man sat outside on a low wooden stool. The clouds had thinned. The sky above was soft and blue-gray, with the faintest orange near the edge. A soft breeze passed through the grass. The village was almost silent, except for the occasional sound of wood cracking, or the shuffle of someone tending their animals one last time before nightfall. He closed his eyes and listened, to the wind, to the soft cluck of chickens in a nearby coop, to the world that had no machines, no bright lights, no noise of wheels or horns, just nature, and people living within it. After some time he returned inside. His wife was humming again. The children were already under blankets, their heads turned toward the fire, eyes barely open. He tucked one of them in, pulling the fabric up to her chin. She smiled in her sleep. He lay down beside them. The roof above was firm. The hearth glowed faintly, and outside the stars waited patiently. No battles had been fought that day. No sickness had taken anyone. The fire hadn't gone out. Sometimes that was enough. The morning was colder today. It crept in quietly, through the cracks in the shutters and the spaces between stones. The man felt it even before opening his eyes. His breath was visible in the pale light. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving only a few shy embers to glow beneath the ash. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children, and gently reached for a woolen wrap nearby. It smelled like smoke and sleep. As he tucked it around his shoulders, he moved toward the hearth. The stones felt cool under his feet. He crouched and breathed into the coals, stirring them with a stick. A faint orange spark danced to life. He added twigs one by one, then a log. It began to catch, crackling softly, sending tiny curls of smoke upward. The warmth returned slowly, brushing the cold from his cheeks, chasing it back into the corners of the room. Behind him, his wife stirred. "Too cold for the river today," she mumbled. He nodded. They had planned to wash clothes, but cold water could steal strength from your bones. The village knew better than to fight the season. Plans changed with the wind, with the clouds, with the chill that whispered beneath the door. Instead, the day would be spent inside. He fetched a pot of water from the jug and hung it above the fire. The warmth would later it could be poured into a basin for washing faces and hands. Not a full bath. Not in this season. A proper bath came rarely, and only with preparation. As the children began to stir, the sound of chickens came from outside. Low, sleepy cluck. He pulled on his boots, stiff with cold, and stepped out quietly. The yard was slick with frost. Each blade of grass sparkled faintly in the morning light, coated with tiny crystals that melted underfoot. A thin trail of footprints led to the coop. He opened the wooden door slowly. The chickens blinked at him, confused at first, then began hopping down one by one. He scattered a handful of grain, and they pecked eagerly, tails bobbing. Inside the coop there were 3 eggs, still warm. He tucked them into a small cloth pouch, carried them carefully back to the house, and set them on the wooden table. One would be saved. The other 2 would go into the morning meal. The smell of baking flatbread began to rise. His wife worked near the fire, shaping the dough with quick hands. The flat stones near the hearth were already hot. She pressed one disc onto the surface, and it sizzled faintly. The children watched, sleepy-eyed, the way they always did. He cracked an egg into a wooden bowl, stirred it gently, and added it to a pot of oats and milk. As the meal warmed, so did the house. Steam from the pot softened the air. The light grew brighter, as the clouds outside shifted. The children ate in silence, eyes fixed on the food, small hands wrapped around warm wooden bowls. The bread was soft, the oats were thick. It was enough. Later, the man reached for the old saddle. It needed mending. Not because they owned a horse, but because the neighbor did, and had asked for help. The leather was dry, cracked from years of use in rain. He used a bit of tallow and a bone awl, pushing the new stitch through one tiny hole at a time. The work was quiet, steady. It took the whole morning, and when he was done, he handed it to his oldest son to carry next door. As the door creaked shut, the wind began to rise again. Outside, the sky darkened. A storm was brewing, not the kind with thunder and lightning, but one of long, steady rain, the kind that soaks everything slowly. People moved faster now, collecting tools from the garden, covering piles of hay, bringing animals under shelter. The man stood in the doorway for a while, watching it come in. The fields turned gray, the chickens huddled under the coop's slanted roof, the goats pressed against the walls. In the far distance, a black shape moved slowly across the horizon. A cart, heavy with something, pulled by a pair of oxen. He wondered who it belonged to. He returned inside and closed the door. The rest of the day would be spent under a roof. His wife sat with the children, showing them how to mend worn cloth. One girl held a sock with a hole in the toe. Another tried to patch a sleeve with clumsy stitches. The man returned to his carving, smoothing the handle of a spoon he'd nearly finished. The rhythm of the work brought calm. Raindrops began tapping on the roof, soft at first, then steady, like 1,000 tiny drummers. The fire hissed slightly, when a stray drop found the chimney. Outside, puddles formed. Inside, stories began to flow. The man told one from when he was a boy, about a time the river froze, so thick that they walked across it. How they found a fish, frozen mid-leap near the shore. The children laughed. They imagined it hanging in the air, eyes wide with surprise. The rain grew louder, but inside the room felt smaller, safer. Later, his wife added dried thyme to a pot of stew. The smell filled the room, sharp and earthy. She passed him a piece of bread to tear into the pot, and he dipped it in, soaking up the warm broth. One child leaned against his arm, the other resting a head in her mother's lap. It was a slow day, but a full one. That night, they ate by firelight. The storm outside rumbled softly. The roof above held strong. The walls didn't leak. The children yawned early and crawled into their blankets. The man placed another log on the fire and stretched out his legs. His wife leaned back against the wall. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The rain said it all. The storm passed sometime during the night. No one noticed exactly when. It slipped away quietly, like a guest who didn't want to say goodbye. By morning, only the smell of damp earth and wet wood remained, and the puddles in the yard glistened in the early light. The man woke to stillness. The fire had burned low again, but the air inside the cottage was not as sharp as before. The cold had softened. He stretched his arms and looked around the room. The others were still asleep, his wife under a patchwork blanket. The children curled up together like little bundles of warmth. He rose quietly. Outside, the sky was pale and soft. No birds called yet. The world was still wet. He opened the wooden door just a little and let in a breath of fresh air. The scent was clean. The storm had washed everything. Even the dust from the road was gone. He stepped out and walked slowly toward the small garden. The ground squished under his feet, and water clung to the leaves. Some of the herbs had drooped from the weight of the rain, but others stood firm. The lavender, especially, seemed taller. He ran his hand gently over it. The smell lingered on his palm. Farther out, the field looked peaceful. The grass shimmered in the morning light. He turned and looked at the cottage, smoke just starting to curl from the chimney. Then he walked to the edge of the path, where a single tree stood. It had been there longer than the cottage. He sat beneath it, resting his back against the trunk. Listen. The world made soft sounds, nothing sharp or sudden. A drip from a leaf, the creak of the branches. A rooster crowed somewhere, but not nearby. The rest of the village was slow to rise. No carts rattled yet. No shouting. Just quiet. He sat there until he heard the door open again. His youngest child peeked out, hair tousled, eyes still sleepy. "Papa?" He smiled and waved. The child came running across the damp yard, barefoot, clutching a blanket. The man lifted the little one onto his lap and wrapped the blanket around them both. Together, they listened. The child leaned a head against his chest. Inside, the day began. Bread dough was shaped and placed near the hearth. The remaining stew from the night before was warmed. It tasted even better now, thicker and richer. The family ate slowly, talking in soft voices. The man said they would visit the old mill today. The rain had filled the river, and when the river was full, the mill wheel turned fast and strong. The miller would be happy to trade flour again. They gathered a small bag of dried beans, and some of the eggs they had saved. The man wrapped everything in cloth and placed it in a worn basket. The walk to the mill was not far, but the path was muddy. They wore thick shoes, and the youngest was carried on his shoulders. The older children walked carefully, avoiding puddles, laughing when their feet still sank. Birds were out now, hopping along branches, chirping at the return of the sun. The mill stood near the bend of the river. Its wheel turned steadily, splashing water as it moved. The sound was steady and calm. It was like the rhythm of a heartbeat, slow and strong. The man waved to the miller, who was already outside checking the gears. "Still working after all that rain," the miller said with a smile. They exchanged greetings, spoke about the weather, and laughed about how the chickens refused to come out during the storm. Then they made their trade, eggs and beans for a bag of ground flour. The miller also offered a small bundle of dried apple slices. "For the little ones," he said. They thanked him and began the walk back. On the way, the man pointed out mushrooms growing near the edge of the wood. Some were safe, he said, and some were not. The children listened carefully. He showed them which had the smooth caps, and which ones to never touch. As they reached home, the sun was warmer. Clothes were hung on lines to dry. The goats were let out to graze. The chickens scratched happily in the softened dirt. The man sat again near the garden, shelling peas into a wooden bowl while his wife kneaded dough inside. Later, they prepared a meal together. Flatbread cooked on a hot stone. Soup, made from lentils. carrots and bits of dried meat. The flour from the mill was used to bake a simple cake sweetened with honey. The children helped stir the mixture, and the smell filled the cottage. It was a treat, not something they had every week. As the cake cooled, the man sharpened a knife. Not for danger, but for bread. He used a smooth stone and water, pulling the blade across it slowly. Back and forth. Back and forth. It was peaceful work. The sound of the blade on stone was like a whisper. Outside, the goats bleated gently, and a crow called from a nearby tree. By afternoon, the air grew warmer still. It was time to mend the fence. The man fetched his tools: wooden mallet, fresh rope, a handful of nails. He worked along the edge of the yard, where a section had weakened. The post had leaned during the storm. He straightened it, replaced the beam and tied it securely. One of the children brought him a drink of cool water. He smiled and took it, wiping his forehead with a sleeve. When the work was done, he sat with his back to the repaired fence, looking over the yard. It was small, but it was theirs. The chickens wandered freely. A cat, not their own, slinked across the stones. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a simple tune on a reed flute. That evening, they ate outside. It was rare, but the weather allowed it. They laid out a cloth, placed bowls of food, tore pieces of bread with their hands. The youngest dropped a spoon, and the dog a neighbor's grabbed it and ran. The children laughed until they couldn't breathe. The man laughed too. Afterward, they sat quietly as the sun began to dip. The sky turned orange, then purple. Bats began to flit above, darting in and out of view. His wife lit a small lantern and placed it on the windowsill. The man leaned back on his elbows, listening to the crickets start their slow song. The stars appeared one by one. When it grew darker, they returned in. The children were bathed in warm water, one at a time, and wrapped in thick cloth. They smelled like herbs and soap. The fire crackled. The dog had returned and curled up by the hearth. The man placed a log on the flames, then sat with a spoon in hand. The cake was ready. They each had a slice, sweet and warm. The children smiled with sticky lips. It was a quiet kind of joy, the kind that lingers. Afterward, his wife began to hum a lullaby. The tune was old, older than the cottage, older than the fields. It was passed down from her mother, and her mother before. The children listened with heavy eyes. Outside, the stars multiplied. The man watched from the doorway. He took in the night, the cool air, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of life continuing. Then he returned inside, pulled the blanket higher over his youngest child, and lay down by the fire. Tomorrow would come, but for now this day was ending. The way it should, warm, full, and still. Morning light trickled through the cracks in the wooden shutters, soft and golden, like warm milk. Inside the cottage, the coals from the night before had nearly faded, but they still gave off a faint red glow, like the last breath of a tired ember. The man opened his eyes slowly. His back ached slightly, a familiar kind of ache, not sharp but dull, like something that had lived there forever. He sat up, wrapped a wool cloth around his shoulders, and listened. A bird was singing. It wasn't a grand song, just a simple, repeating note. It reminded him that the seasons were shifting. Summer had gone, autumn was holding its breath, and winter was waiting just behind the trees. He walked to the hearth and stirred the fire. A few dry twigs, a careful puff of air, and the flames returned, crackling gently, not with urgency, but with the quiet hum of beginning again. His wife was still asleep, her face soft in the early light, and the children mumbled in their dreams. It was time for a task long put off. The roof needed mending. A few days earlier, during the storm, he'd noticed a slow drip. Just a few drops had fallen from the beam near the hearth, but that was enough. A weak roof meant cold nights and damp blankets, and worse, mold. They couldn't afford that. He stood outside and looked up. A handful of thatched spots had thinned, their straw broken or missing. The sky above was soft and pale, the kind of day when work felt possible. Not too hot, Not too bitter. He gathered his tools. A wooden ladder, bundles of dried straw, a hook for pulling, and twine for binding. He climbed slowly. From the top, the view stretched. The fields beyond the village shimmered in the light breeze. Tiny wisps of smoke rose from other chimneys. The woods in the distance were just beginning to blush orange and gold. Autumn was creeping in with gentle finger. He worked methodically, one bundle at a time. He packed new straw between the existing layers, pressing them down, tying them with care. The roof made soft rustling sounds with every movement. Below, he could hear the clatter of dishes as his wife prepared breakfast, and the giggles of children chasing each other through the garden. His fingers scratched against the dry straw. Dust floated up and tickled his nose, but he didn't sneeze. He paused sometimes, not from tiredness, but to watch. A butterfly passed once, fluttering near the roof, like it was curious. A breeze ruffled his shirt. For a moment, the world held its breath. By midday he finished. The roof was tight again. He climbed down slowly, shaking bits of straw from his sleeves. His wife had left a bowl of soup near the door, thick with barley and root vegetables. He sat on the stone step and ate in silence. The warm broth coated his tongue, and he felt it spread through his chest like comfort. Later, he took the children to gather firewood. The woods were not far, just beyond the last row of houses. The trees there were tall and crooked, like old men leaning on invisible canes. Fallen branches were everywhere, some dry, some dead. The children pointed out mushrooms and odd-shaped leaves. One of them found a feather, long brown and soft. They tucked it behind their ear like a badge of honor. The man carried a bundle on his back, tied with twine. Each of the children carried a small handful. Even the smallest one tried, dragging a stick nearly as long as they were tall. They stopped once, by a small stream that trickled through the underbrush. The water was cold, clear, and full of tiny pebbles that sparkled in the sun. Back at home, the wood was stacked carefully. He showed the children how to place the driest ones at the top, where they could be grabbed first. He tapped each log, letting them hear the difference in sound between wood that would burn clean and wood that still held too much water. Then they sat on the ground and watched the chickens, who clucked and pecked in the dirt, chasing small bugs with surprising speed. As the sun dipped low again, they brought out the oil lamp. It was time for the quiet work, the kind done inside by the fire. His wife spun wool with her spindle, her fingers moving steadily, rhythmically. The children mended small holes in socks and tunics. The man took out his wooden tools and began carving. He was shaping a spoon. It was not for anyone in particular. He just liked the feeling of smoothing the wood, turning rough edges into something gentle. The knife moved slowly, shaving curl after curl from the block. The firelight danced across the grain of the wood. It felt good to create something. Outside, the wind picked up. It was not a sharp wind, just enough to make the branches sway and the shutters creak. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, then went quiet. The man placed the nearly finished spoon on the table and stretched his arm. The children were already yawning. He lifted the smallest one into his lap and began telling a story. Not one from a book, because they had no books, but from memory. A tale of a clever fox and a slow, stubborn bear who wanted to catch the moon in a net. The children listened with wide eyes, even though they had heard the story many times before. His wife added little parts, changing a word, making the bear clumsier, the fox smarter. Together they laughed, quietly but deeply. After the story, the children were tucked into their blankets. One had brought a handful of dried lavender to place under the pillow. The man smiled at that. The scent would help them sleep, just as it had helped his mother and her mother before that. He stepped outside once more. The night was cooler. Stars dusted the sky. He could smell the smoke from their chimney, mixing with the damp scent of fallen leaves. A neighbor passed by, nodding. They didn't speak. There was no need. The silence was full enough. The moon was almost full. It lit the path in silver. The man thought about the seasons, about how fast the days moved when you were always working, always preparing, and yet there was a beauty in it. A steadiness, the rhythm of days that began with fire and ended with stories. He returned inside. The spoon was still on the table. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, then set it beside the others they had made through the years. Some were rough, some smooth, all useful. He lay down near the hearth, wrapping himself in a wool blanket. The coals glowed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind, to the fire, to the breath of his family, and then to sleep. The morning began with a soft knocking sound. No urgency, just the kind of knock that asks politely to be noticed. The man sat up slowly, blinking away the traces of sleep. The fire had gone quiet, leaving behind only a few smoldering embers. It was not cold, not yet, but there was a hush in the air, the kind that told you the season was changing, even if no one said it out loud. He opened the door. It was Thomas, the neighbor from 3 houses down. His cloak was dusted with the faintest touch of dew, and he carried a woven basket. "Morning," Thomas said. "Bread day." The man smiled. He had almost forgotten. Once a week the families took turns baking large loaves of communal bread in the village oven. Today, it was their turn. His wife appeared behind him, already tying her hair back. She took the basket and nodded with the quiet focus of someone who knew exactly how much flour she had left. The children were up now too, sleepy-eyed and barefoot, their hair messy like small haystacks. One of them yawned so deeply it almost became a word. The smell of the dough soon filled the house, warm, yeasty, comforting. His wife kneaded it gently, slowly folding it over itself like a lullaby. Outside, the village was beginning to hum. Someone was sweeping the walkway. Another was stacking dried herbs. Near a window, 2 older women walked by with baskets of wool, and somewhere in the distance, a blacksmith's hammer rang out, soft and steady like a heartbeat. He walked toward the shared oven with the fresh loaves. The path was familiar. Each stone along the road seemed to know him. He greeted a shepherd boy on the way, who was feeding a lamb with a bit of crushed oats. The oven was already glowing, huge, round, built from heavy stone, and warm to the touch. Smoke drifted lazily upward, curling like ribbons in the air. The loaves were placed inside. Each one was marked with a small symbol. His family's sign was a simple crosshatch. That way, when they were pulled from the heat, there would be no confusion, no taking more than what belonged to you. In a world with no extra, fairness was everything. Back home, the children had gathered flowers, little ones from the edge of the field. They tied them into a crown and placed it on their mother's head. She laughed, not loudly, but with that kind of joy that stays in your chest long after the sound has faded. Today was special, a celebration day, not for kings or saints or wars, just for the harvest, the end of growing and the start of storing. The village would gather for a simple feast, with foods from each home: stew, bread, apples, dried nuts, pickled onions, and a single roasted goose, shared among men. Tables were being set up in the square, long wooden planks balanced on barrels, covered in cloths that had been passed down from grandmothers and great-aunts. Jugs of water, clay cups, and spoons carved by hand were arranged neat. There was music too, a flute, a drum, and a young boy with a bell tied to his ankle. The man helped carry bundles of dried herbs to hang above the tables. They weren't just for decoration. Some would be brewed into tea, others used to bless the space. It was a blend of belief and beauty, a world where even thyme and rosemary had voices. As people arrived, the square filled slowly. No one rushed. Everyone greeted. Everyone. Even the old widow who barely left her house came, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her cane tapping softly against the ground. The children ran between the adults, weaving in and out like bees in a garden. The man sat with his family on a wooden bench. His wife passed him a cup of broth, steaming and rich with flavor. He drank it slowly, savoring the quiet in the middle of all the noise. People were talking about weather, animals, and how early the frost might come this year. No one mentioned battles or taxes. Today, the world was smaller and softer. A priest stood near the center and offered a simple blessing. Not too long, not too grand, just a few words to thank the earth, the sun, and the hands that had worked the soil. Everyone bowed their heads. Even the children were quiet for a moment. Then they ate. The bread was perfect. Golden on the outside, soft inside, with a hint of salt. The stew was warm and thick, with chunks of carrot and bits of onion that melted in the mouth. Someone passed a dish of mashed beans. Another brought pears, cut and sprinkled with cinnamon. The feast wasn't endless, but it was enough. The music returned. People danced, not with skill, but with joy. The kind of dancing where you forget your feet and just move. The man didn't dance much. He watched, holding a small child in his lap, stroking their hair gently. His wife did dance, her flower crown slightly tilted, her cheeks glowing in the light of the fire. As the sky deepened, the stars began to blink into view. The flames of the central fire flickered tall and orange, casting shadows that swayed and curled. People sat closer together now. Blankets were wrapped around shoulders. The wind was kind, just enough to remind everyone they were still part of something bigger. Someone began telling stories, not long ones, just fragments, bits of old tales. A fox that tricked a farmer, a woman who turned into a deer to escape a cruel lord, a singing stone. The man listened, his eyes half closed. The voices were soft, weaving through the night like threads in a warm blanket. Eventually, the fire was allowed to die down. People hugged each other goodnight. Some carried sleeping children. Others walked in pairs, leaning on one another. The man helped gather the cups and stack the bench. His arms were tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from living, not fighting. Back home, the children were already snoring softly. His wife sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a clay mug of warm cider. He sat beside her and they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The room was full of silence, but not empty. It was thick with everything they had seen and done and felt. He stirred the fire once more, adding one last log. The flames rose gently, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Outside, the wind rustled the tree. The moon had risen fully now, round and white, floating just above the hill. It looked down, quiet and ancient. He stretched out on the wool mat, pulling the blanket over his chest. His wife curled beside him. The coals in the hearth glowed dimly, like the final light of a long day. He closed his eyes, and in that stillness, where there were no taxes to pay, no lords to fear, no hunger to chase, just the quiet ticking of time, and the gentle rhythm of sleep, he drifted away. If you are still awake, then I think you have to see the video from 22nd minute of the story, or play this side video as may it can help you sleep better. Goodbye.